Hi, everybody. We're going to get started in just a few minutes while we let everybody in and folks get settled.
Good afternoon, folks. As we allow more and more people to come in, we're going to go ahead and wait a little bit to begin. I'll go ahead and share screen for our slides. For those of you joining us today, I just wanted to let everyone know that we do have a Q&A portion. If you do have questions, go ahead and fill it out in our Q&A portion, and our speakers, when they get a chance, will go ahead and answer those. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being here for the legislative briefing on the voter participation gap and voter education solutions. Today, you're going to hear about our coalition's advocacy efforts over the past year to push for state budget funding for voter education and outreach, with the specific purpose of closing participation gaps in the electorate. You're also going to hear from some great speakers representing community groups about why more robust voter education and outreach funding is critical to reaching the communities they work with, and also the work that they do to inform, empower, and turn out voters. At the end of the webinar, we'll have time for questions. So throughout the webinar, if you have questions, use the Q&A feature, and we will answer as many as possible at the end of the presentations. You'll also be receiving a leave behind summary of the issues after the webinar. So with that, let's begin. Can we go to the next slide? So this coalition involved in this effort came together over the last year with a common goal, which was to develop a real actionable solution to creating a more representative democracy. And that solution is for state funding to purposefully fund voter education and outreach to close participation gaps for underrepresented groups of voters. We came together because despite the fact that California is a majority minority state, and the fact that we as a state have passed important laws designed to expand voting options, remove impediments to voting, and expand access to voting, there are still significant disparities in voter participation amongst youth and people of color compared to our older non-Hispanic white population. This fact can be seen in the November 2020 election turnout. Despite it being a historically high turnout year, turnout rates of eligible Asian American, Black, and Latino Californians were between 11 to 20 percentage points lower than comparable rates for eligible non-Hispanic white Californians. These trends have persisted over several presidential elections in California. And disparities in turnout rates between younger and older Californians continue to be a pattern as well. November 2020 turnout rates for eligible 18 to 24-year-olds was 20 percentage points lower than the overall population in California. This is something that we do not have to accept as the norm. We can do something to close these participation gaps. And why is it so critical to address this head on? Because when our democracy does not represent the people, decisions about critical issues that impact people's lives happen without the values and the priorities from a large portion of our population. And these trends of underrepresentation continue despite laws to expand voting options like early voting, same-day registration, vote by mail for all, Voters' Choice Act, ballot drop boxes, early voting voting locations, vote centers, etc. All of these have provided the needed access, but have not gone far enough to close participation gaps. Research points to one of these reasons being that many people are still unaware of expanded voting options. For example, a need to educate people on how to complete and submit a vote by mail ballot is critical because rejected vote by mail ballots disproportionately affect people of color. And when early voting sites go underutilized, the answer should not be to reduce those options. The answer should be to tell more people about them. Access to voting must be paired with access to education and outreach about voting options in order to have the full effect of increasing voter turnout and the full utilization of new voting options. Next slide, please. So our coalition came up with a solution, and that was to allocate state funding to fund voter education and outreach at both the state and local level. For the state, that would be a statewide outreach campaign, and the local level through county elections officers who can provide official information, and also through community-based organizations who are the trusted messengers for many communities who are harder to reach. This year, we advocated for $85 million in a state budget allocation to go towards voter education and outreach at the state and local level to close participation gaps. Our letter from this year is shown on the screen. And this ask is broken down by $35 million going towards the Secretary of State for that statewide education and outreach campaign per election. And then the $50 million is represented by $2 per eligible voter in all 58 counties. And that would be for local level voter education and outreach by both elections officials and community-based organizations. And while the state did not approve this budget allocation this year, after a year of advocacy, we've identified a number of opportunities to move forward, including refining the way that funding for voter education and outreach can be allocated, ensuring a mechanism for community-based organizations to be a core part of the solution, and equitably allocating outreach dollars to where they're needed most. So our coalition is now working towards these opportunities in the near future to actually get state funding approved for state and local level voter education and outreach to close participation gaps. So after we hear from our speakers, our community organization representatives, you're going to hear from a speaker who will delve more into what you can do to support our effort to support voter education and outreach as a critical solution to creating a more representative democracy. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Dorian Call with the National Association of Latino Elected Officials, who is going to talk more about some of the work that they do.
Great. Thank you very much, Melissa, and thank you all for having me. I'll be talking a little bit about voter registration differences, but certainly the trends. And I know that Melissa alluded to a few of them in terms of the participation gap. So I hope to provide you with not only the data, but also some of the points that Melissa made in reiterating the importance of having outreach and certainly mobilization efforts around basic information. Next slide. From a midterm perspective, especially because we're coming off of a midterm, I thought that I would include some numbers from a midterm perspective. 13.24 million Californians voted in the election 2018. That was an increase from 2014. Just to put it into context, 2018 was a record high in most states election turnout. 2014 was quite a low. Next slide. Looking at from a white, non-Latino participation using census CPS voting numbers, one of the things that we see is that certainly the white non-Latino population specifically, the gap does exist certainly between the voting age citizen population and the actual voters. We see that jump right in 2018 with regards to the increase in voting, but the gap is much less, as we'll see in the next few slides. Next slide. Black participation, for example, we see that a slight increase certainly in 2018, and then that big drop off in 2014 that I described earlier. But as you see from the voting age citizen population, and when you compare it to the actual voters, there is a considerable gap that exists with regards to participation, certainly for the Black community, voter community specifically. Next slide. The same participation gap exists within the Asian American community, certainly, and as we see, it's a little bit more prominent, as we can see from the line, the top line, which is voting age citizens population, and certainly from a actual voter population. Again, we see that increase in 2018 with a slight drop off in 2014. Next slide. Same thing within the Latino participation trend. If we see, again, the slight increase in 2018, slight drop off in 2014, but we do see a considerable gap as well with the voting age citizen population. And when we're actually looking at the actual voters or the actual Latino voters. Next slide. When we're looking at it from a registered voters perspective, and I've seen this a lot where we always see registration numbers or the turnout as registered voters. When we look at that, we'll see some closing of the gap, for example, between non-Latino white, especially when we're comparing to the Black community with 87.9 and 88.9%. However, when we're looking at it from a perspective of voting age population, next slide, we see that those gaps really widen, especially when we're looking at communities, Black community, certainly, the Asian American community, and certainly the Latino community, where, again, as Melissa mentioned, those rates are at sometimes 10, sometimes even higher between the white non-Latino population compared to other communities and other race groups, certainly. Next slide. So looking at it from a presidential election, certainly trying to understand whether those gaps still exist when we're looking at it from a presidential election, when we do know that there are more people that are more voters that do vote during a presidential election. We know that, again, 2020 was a record voter turnout in most states, with 16.9 million Californians voted in election 2020. Next slide. However, when we take a look at the numbers by Hispanic origin and race, we do see those gaps that Melissa was describing earlier, certainly from a Latino perspective, over 20 percentage points. And when we see other communities as well, much lower than the white non-Latino. Again, I mentioned that 2020 was a record turnout. Even within that record turnout, we do see some increases, certainly. We see the increases across all groups, but certainly we also see that participation gap that does exist when we're comparing it between different groups as well, but certainly within the white non-Latino population. Next slide. I think one of the most important things to really take away from all the different numbers is that the low turnout is not due to apathy. I've heard time and time again this myth, right? This just completely wrong sort of statement that communities are really not going out to vote simply because they don't really care about voting. However, what we've learned from not only our research and all the research that I've seen, and certainly reliable research, is that sustained investment in mobilizing is completely necessary. We saw the turnout increase in 2020 because there was an increased investment in many of the states. We also saw an increased investment in 2018, and we saw the turnout go up as well. So we know that underrepresented communities also need information, as Melissa sort of alluded earlier. Certainly, from all the research, certainly from our own research, but certainly from the CID election 2020 research, is that Asian Americans, Black and Latino are less likely to know where to find voting information than non-Hispanic whites. In our more recent survey that we conducted over 9 weeks, we also found that California Latino registered voters specifically report not having sufficient information or instructions from the state to request a vote by mail ballot. One of the key things here that I really want everyone to take away is that the meaningful engagement and being responsive to the needs and opinions of voters is really critical. And I'll also leave you with a specific anecdote, certainly that we learned from our some forums that we conducted in Los Angeles about 3 years ago when we wanted to understand a little bit more how Latinos were going to be looking at vote centers. And one of the respondents and one of the participants specifically was talking about how they felt that their vote really mattered, that they felt voting was really key and important. They described it as a test and how important it was for them to get it right. And without the necessary information, without the information on where to get their ballot, whether they wanted to vote in mail-in ballot or whether they wanted to vote at a vote center, was really key and important. The information on how to navigate that ballot, especially for new voters, especially those voters that are turning of age, for example, that are eligible to register and I just registered. What is the information that they need to be able to really feel comfortable and really feel like they can actually cast their ballot confidently? And without that, it's really a challenge for many Latinos, certainly in the Latino community and other communities, to really make their voices heard in the election. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dorian. And next, we're going to go to Kristen Nimmers, Policy and Campaign Manager with the California Black Power Network.
Thank you, Melissa. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate y'all being here. Again, I am Kristen Nimmers, Policy and Campaign Manager with the California Black Power Network. Next slide. We are a grassroots coalition of Black-led and Black-serving organizations throughout the state. We're working in community and strategic collaboration as a coalition to address discrimination, systemic racism, and anti-Black racism, which includes expanding accessibility and participation in our election process. We came out of the California Black Census and Redistricting Hub and the African American Civic Engagement Project, which were both projects of the California Cause Alliance. And through that work, we've engaged over 1 million residents in census and the 2020 election. We engaged hundreds of community leaders and residents in the redistricting process that recently happened. And then even on the recent elections in the June primary and the November election, we engaged over 50,000 Black voters through direct action as far as phone banking, canvassing, and other things. Next slide. So on the next slide, just had some pictures of some of the work that we've done. So we have a lot of experience engaging Black voters, doing targeted outreach, tailoring messages, and ensuring voters are getting the different information that they need. For example, the houseless community may need information on how to register without an address, while the formerly incarcerated community may need information on whether they're eligible, et cetera. And so we can really speak to the importance of investment in voter education and targeted outreach and working with community organizations who are often the trusted messengers in their communities to tailor this message through direct outreach. On the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of engaging Black voters. So California has the 5th largest population of Black folks in any state. We make up about 5% of the California population, which is a significant population of folks in need of voter education to ensure that they're engaged in our democracy. The struggle with that, however, is that Black communities are also the most impacted across almost every issue that impacts and creates barriers to participation in our election processes. So this includes things like houselessness, where in places like LA, we make up 40% of the houseless population, and folks are hard to reach because they don't have addresses or phone numbers or are in need of other immediate resources and help before they can even think about voting. Like, you know, if you're starving, how can you also be thinking about voting, or if you need immediate medical attention or things like that. We also are a state that is heavily incarcerated due to historical discrimination and disparities in the criminal justice system. A lot of Black folks are incarcerated and are also impacted in that way with their votes. And I'll talk more about justice impacted voters in my last slide, but there's a lot of distrust of online forums. Black folks generally prefer to cast their votes in person. And as election processes have changed significantly over the last 2 years, we're often in need of multiple touches, sharing information on where and how to vote, on whether the county is a VCA county or not, if their polling places changed. So there's just a lot more institutional barriers to voting due to the conditions many Black folks are facing that requires investment in the education of our community. And then lastly, Black folks, along with many others due to the housing crisis, are really being pushed out of urban hubs and into emerging communities that don't have established organizing infrastructure. And what I mean by that is that, like, one, folks are moving to areas like the Central Valley and in the Inland Empire, which are in the process of developing infrastructure to serve and account for the growth in population, but don't necessarily have that infrastructure now. And two, that there may not be a large ecosystem of community organizations to reach those folks. So for folks that aren't typically engaged by traditional campaigns because they aren't likely voters, it's often up to community organizations, to the registrar, to the election offices in those communities to ensure that folks know how to register, that they know how to participate, that they know what's on the ballot. And so there's definitely needs to be an investment in both of those areas to ensure that folks have the resources to engage these underrepresented communities. Next slide. And on this slide, I wanted to talk about like Black voter turnout. So on the last slide, I actually missed one bullet point, but you know, the likely Black voter is aging and not being replaced by young voters. So you can see in 2020, Black voters age 65 or older turned out at 83% in the 2020 general election, while Black voters 18 to 24 turned out at 63%. And so that's a 20% gap. And that gap was even wider in 2021, where Black folks aged 65 or older turned out at 72%, while Black voters 18 to 24 turned out at 32%, almost a 40% gap. And so you can also see in the little maps that I have at the top that the Black population in California versus the Black voters in California. And Also, I think Dorian mentioned it earlier as well, but in 2020, 64% of Black eligible voters cast the ballot compared to 74% of white eligible voters. And that's also a 10% gap. And so on top of the fact that aging voters aren't being replaced by young voters, there are just continued disparities in this voter turnout. Next slide. And also wanted to touch specifically on justice impacted voters as well, because a significant population of incarcerated and justice impacted folks are Black folks. And so one, eligibility wise, you can still vote if you're currently incarcerated. And so this includes folks who are serving time for a misdemeanor or awaiting trial, and the participation in the effort of jails to educate and ensure opportunity to vote for folks differs across prisons and regions. Some folks provide a lot of information, some provide a little information that might be hard to access. Even community organizations who are trying to provide that information and do in-reach in jails often have trouble even gaining access to prisons to provide that education. And so there's really even disparities across the different prisons on what information folks have access to, on how voting is set up within those areas. And so that's also a need for investment in that education. And then also with the passage of Prop 17, we recently re-enfranchised 50,000 voters. And so there are many people that don't even know that they're eligible to vote. If they've been incarcerated for a long time, they may not understand the different changes that have been made to the election processes, that you can vote by mail now, that you can do the same day registration, that you may be able to vote different vote centers within your area. And so many formerly incarcerated voters often denied the right to vote due to de facto disenfranchisement. And this includes those informational barriers that I just mentioned, but also procedural barriers where folks may not have access to a computer to register, or voter suppression where folks are incorrectly told that if they're on probation, they can't vote, or they may just believe that due to other misinformation. And so for all these reasons, even just thinking about Black and justice impacted voters, there's a significant need to invest in voter education and outreach, to invest and work with community organizations to craft messaging for hard to reach communities, and conduct and help with that outreach. And then just to make targeted investment in diversifying and reaching underrepresented voters in our state. And thank you. So I think I'll pass it back to Melissa.
Thanks, Kristen. And next, we're going to go to Cha Vang, Deputy Director with AAPI's for Civic Empowerment and Education Fund.
Thank you, Melissa. Just also, we wanted to follow up in Kristen in the California Power Network's lead, and just also highlighting some of the needs of Asian American communities. Just a little about AAPI. AAPI for Civic Empowerment Education Fund. We are a network of organizations that are building political power for working class APIs through integrated voter engagement and organizing statewide policies and issues. The things that we do, I'm sorry, can you click one more? I do also have a transitioning slide. The things, what we do is we build capacity and leadership development for leaders on the ground and organizations. We build capacity to run year-round civic engagement programs for engaging API voters, run campaigns and organizing on the ground on local campaigns, and then do a lot of narrative change and cultural organizing work. And our vision for our work is to build a powerful Asian American and Pacific Islander political bloc and uplift API voices. And doing that through implementing that and through a progressive agenda with our multiracial statewide alliance, and that we win structural changes for our communities. Next slide. Our organization is comprised of compiled of steering committee organizations across the state, which, as you can see, are a very diverse group of folks from different communities, Asian American communities. Our 6 steering committee organizations are Chinese Progressive Association, Filipino Advocates for Justice, Hmong Innovating Politics, the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, Filipino Worker Center, Khmer Girls in Action, and we have network partners that we work closely with, such as the California Healthy Nail Salon Collaborative, Jakarta Movement, Asian Solidarity, Okapica, South Bay Youth Changemakers, and EPIC. Next slide, sorry. Wanted to really point out the diversity of our coalition, because in reality, the population of California, the API population in California is so large, and we want to make sure that we emphasize that it is a big and diverse group of, and we get all lumped into the Asian American category, Asian American and Pacific category. So this 2020 census shows that there's over 7 million Asian Americans in California, with about 337,000 Pacific Islanders. And it is a big growth since 2010. It is actually the largest growth across the nation. I just wanted to uplift that we couldn't even, so there's so many Asian American organizations that we couldn't even list all of them. And here, the top 10, according as the most recent American Community Survey in 2019. These are the top 10, and this is a very diverse group of Asian American and very different in experiences, in language, in history in the US, and then also the immigration patterns. And then even within these categories of Asian American groups, there's also subcategories, right? It's just that we see here as the Pacific Islanders, we have such a large group of Pacific Islander, and that they speak very different languages, have different experiences, and wanted to bring this point to highlight the needs of Asian American communities. Next slide. I'm gonna just go through this really fast. The Asian American and Pacific Islander voting population, the overall LEP, sorry, citizen voting age in California is 3.3 million, and the percentage of California eligible voters who are LEPs are 11.6%. And the number of, in those percent of the number of LEP Asian American Pacific Islander citizens of voting age in California is 1.5 million. And in the 25 million citizens who are voting age, about 3.65 million are Asian American Pacific Islander voting age members. Next slide. Just a participation gap a little in 2020, the eligible voter turnout rate for Asian American California was about 19.7% below the total population. And Asian Americans are 14.6% of California's eligible voter population, which were only 10.4% of the voters in the 2020 elections. Next slide for us. Wanted to also uplift the piece around language access. With the diversity of Asian American population, there also are issues around language access and voter engagement. Under the federal and California law, voters are entitled to receive language assistance, but many voters are not aware of these services and their rights. Some of the challenges are there's not very much information that voters receive in the language about the language resources that they can access. And counties don't actually have the resource and staff and or even sometimes interest to effectively reach all the language communities to share information about the upcoming elections in language. And different services are provided depending on where people live and the size of the language communities. So there's different desk shows, and you all might know this. But and so it's very different, and what type of information they get is very different depending on what counties. Next slide. With all the challenges that our county has and making sure that our communities get the information they have, API Force in our work our challenge is always to make sure that we're filling in those gaps of education. In this election, in this 2020, just this last couple weeks of election, we had to, we run our stuff in 9, 10 different languages just to make sure that we are reaching. And one of the things that we did to make sure that our communities get the in-language materials that they need is that we also sent out mailers in language and really picking on, really honing down on populations that need it. And with the limited funds that community-based organizations like ours can do, we were only able to send out about 20,000 mailers to the households. And then about 3,500 in language door hangers as we are out in the field running programs and running, working with our steering committee organizations or partner organizations to educate people at the door and over the phone. And I wanted to really bring these numbers up because with the funding that we, both county and CBOs actually need more funding to make sure that we provide these in-language needs for our communities so that they are going out and they get the information they need to get the ballots in language, and then also be informed to where to vote and how to vote. And this, I wanted to, next slide. Yeah. And so with that, I was going to pass it over to Melissa.
Thank you, Cha. Now we are going to hear from Saun Bell, who is Associate Director with Power California.
Yes, y'all. Grateful to be here on a Thursday. Appreciate folks who are tuning in. Jaleesa, can you hit me with the next slide? So really quick, I'm going to talk about Power California just a bit. Who we are. I mean, we are a statewide organization with an emphasis on the Central Valley. We harness the power of young voters of color and their families to create a California that is equitable and just for all, right, who call California home. Because who doesn't want California to be equitable for all of us? Our alliance spans 20 plus youth organizations who have a combined 30 to 40 year history of organizing young people within their respective communities. You'll see on this map here that we sort of range all the way to the North Bay, to the Bay Area, all the way down to the Central Valley, some of the coastal cities, all the way down to the Inland Empire. And so that's who we are. And specifically, right, we conduct voter outreach to 100,000+ households and voters through phone, canvassing, and text. And, annually we reach about 1 million young voters of color online. Next slide. So I won't belabor these points because Dorian and Melissa did a really wonderful job of really underscoring these. But the main thing is that in terms of 2020 young voter eligibility and turnout is that we all know, right? Young voters increasingly are becoming eligible to vote, right? And they are increasingly turning out. So to Dorian's point, right, it's really not necessarily about apathy. Next slide. But at the same time, right, and this is data from the Center for Inclusive Democracy, good partners of ours. At the same time, you'll see that in addition to youth eligible voter turnout increasing, in terms of like the gap between young voters that are actually turning out versus young voters that are eligible, right, we still have much more work to do on that end. Next slide. So just a couple of things that I want to underscore about young people, that we found in our work over the last several years when Power California used to be started off as a project called the Youth Vote in 2016. One thing that we found through our work and through our polls is that young people are the most politically active of generations, right, of our particular time, right? And then specifically, they increasingly understand the importance of local government and how local politics, right, and participating in sort of local voting, right, affects their day-to-day lives. And at the same time, what we know about young people is that young folks are increasingly identifying as declined to state, right? And what we found in our poll and our polls and our research that we do every 2 years is that they are least likely to be contacted by any party, right? That's on top of being a young person, and that's also on top of being more likely to be declined to state, right? And this is all despite, the data that Dorian showed in terms of, young people are actually not apathetic, right? We're seeing the tremendous data that shows young people of color in particular their turnout is continuing to increase. And then last but not least, right, I just want to underscore a couple of things in our poll. 85% of young folks, are looking to local government to make their daily lives easier. And what we found at Power California and through our alliance, many times as we're engaging young people, there's an initial understanding around, well, I thought voting was about just voting for a president, right? And then they start to learn through their peers, right, that voting is so much more, that there's things that happen at the local level, right, that are just as important of what's happening statewide, right, across California. Next slide. So a couple of things that I just really want to highlight in terms of, what we do to like really engage and really engage young voters of color and to close the civic engagement gap is like one specifically, right, is targeted voter education and registration, which is like a theme that's been, really underscored throughout this presentation, but also like early high school voter education as well. We know that in Black, Brown, low income schools and neighborhoods, the civic engagement, the civic engagement in voter education typically is not the same as in a wealthier neighborhood, right? And so these are really important sort of strategies to make sure to really attend to the civic engagement gap that we see amongst young people, young voters of color. And then secondly, integrated voter engagement. One thing that, we really sort of do at Power and across our alliance, we don't just educate and engage young people when it's on season, right? When there are, elections, we're engaging them every year to really build up their voter resilience, to build them into lifelong voters. Next slide. So a couple things that I want to highlight here, and I'm going to wrap this up. We know that peer-to-peer for young people of color, peer-to-peer outreach really matters, right? The messengers really matter. Young people are much more likely to vote when their peers encourage them to vote, right? We also know that young voter-led awareness, right? Whether that includes registration drive, education, right? Actually bolsters the propensity of young people to also cast their ballots. And we also know that arts and culture and partnering with local young artists, musicians, folks, influencers that young people identify with also significantly increase, the likelihood of them turning out to vote. And then last but not least, social media platforms like your Instagrams and TikTok are places where young people are really being sort of educated on the voting process. I think there's one more bullet here, Jaleesa, that I want to underscore. You click it one more time. And so the last point I just like really want to make, and I'll follow this with like a specific, community-based example. But what we've seen over the last 4 to 6 years is that there is a deep link between community-based organizations, youth serving community-based organizations that can really help develop young leaders, right? And sustain like their engagement beyond one single election season. Right. And so because community-based organizations like Power California, like Filipinos Advocates for Justice, your inner city struggles and community coalitions down in LA, because they have such a consistent presence in the lives of young people, right? They end up having sort of a much more significant impact, right, on that young person's resilience to become a lifelong voter. And so one example that I just want to underscore before I wrap up this presentation is, between 2014 and the 2018 midterm elections, right, particularly in the Central Valley, right, 18 to 24-year-olds in that specific region, roughly about 30,000 young people voted in that region. 2018, 85,000, nearly 85,000 young voters in the Central Valley voted, right? And that was like an impressive 260% increase, right? And that, we could say, we could attribute to, the national like political climate, but I would say largely we can attribute that to the youth members and the community-based organizations in the Central Valley, in the agricultural region, who played a significant role in mobilizing young voters to get out to vote. Check. I think that's the last slide, right, Julissa? Yes, thank you. Back to you, Melissa.
Thank you so much for that. I am so excited to work with all of you here on the panel and also in the audience on making voter education and outreach a core part of implementing our elections, because the work that organizations you just heard from is so critical to turning out voters and closing participation gaps to create a more representative democracy. So thank you. My name is Melissa Romero, Senior Legislative Manager with California Environmental Voters, formerly CLCV. And so to wrap us up and talk about how you can take action, I'm going to pass it to Lysang Secho, who's with California Calls. So thank you.
Hey everyone, Lysang Secho with California Calls, Policy and Campaign Director. First of all, I just, again, want to thank everyone, all of the participants for joining us today. I know we are coming off of the heels of the election. People have been really busy, but really, really value you all attending this to learn more about some of the important issues that are affecting the participation gap. I also want to thank the speakers for actually doing so much preparation to really talk about the constituents they represent and some of the barriers to folks actually coming out to vote. I can't emphasize how important this voter education work is in building a representative democracy. We often go and knock on those doors, and the moments that really inspire us are when we get to educate voters about some of the issues that are happening locally for them, when we're able to share information about what makes things accessible and how do they get out to vote. And also when we see that one conversation can change the lives in the course of so many. And so just so inspiring to be here with all of the speakers and all of the hard work that they've been doing. Our coalition, we've been really involved in thinking through how to close some of these participation gaps. And we really want to make a call out to all of the folks here to really join us in that effort. Obviously we did not pass our 2022 budget request, and we're still doing a lot of research to better understand the needs of voter education for all Californians. So, we have a couple of research projects we'd love to fund to be able to know what are the things that mobilize folks to vote, what are the things that inspire folks to vote, and also like what are some of the needs county by county and for different constituents and stakeholders. I also think some of the focus of our research is really going to be around equity measures. Like, how do we look at equity? There's obviously a huge group, and Dorian had showed all those slides of some of the participation gaps. How do we really continue to close that? And also, just kind of thinking through this last budget request cycle, we are going to be sharing out after this meeting a document that kind of shares a little bit of texture around our budget request, around some of the challenges and our efforts moving forward. And so that will actually go out to all of the participants here, or if you registered. And then we really want to make sure, like, we need more folks in this fight. It isn't enough just to have the community-based organizations, the counties, and on this fight, we really need everyone to make sure that voter education is a priority, to make sure we do have that representative democracy. So now I'm going to close. I just want to make sure that we take some questions for the participants and be able to answer those. And those could be for the speakers or for the coalition.
So we do have a few questions that came through the transom independently. I'm Dora Rose. I'm Deputy Director with the League of Women Voters of California. Hi, everybody. And one that we have for the speakers, for the panelists, are what are the ways that we can keep people engaged in the political process now that the election is over? What do you do in between times to make sure that the momentum isn't lost? And thanks.
I think one big thing is like talking to folks about like the results of the election. Like, we got you to come out, we got you to vote, you participated in this process, and this is what it meant, this is what it turned out to be. And then also helping folks to understand that voting is only a minor part of the process, but when we pass these things, like these propositions and things like that, how are we also engaged in the implementation? And so like continuing to engage voters on the implementation process, continuing to let them know about how their vote counted and what their vote really and engaging them in those ways, I think is important.
Thank you. Let's see, something else just came up. Are there examples of how California government and nonprofits have partnered together in areas other than voting to reach hard to reach communities? And I'll put that out to either the speakers or Melissa Lysang, you might be interested in answering that.
I can quickly touch on the census, and certainly the census count, where there was another opportunity to really partner with government jurisdictions and entities and so forth, not only in California, but throughout the country, certainly. But I think there was another opportunity. You know, we sort of, from the last question, certainly, talking about it from the perspective of civic engagement as a larger sort of entity. I think that's one really key important factor, right, where it really does touch upon other aspects of civic engagement and really engaging youth, certainly, and other groups outside of an election, I think is really key. And certainly census has been one. I think the other piece that I will add that I think is related to the first question as well is really this idea that it's not just presidential election or midterm elections, right? There are also local elections that happen year round and happen every year. So making sure that we're not sort of framing engagement as only coming every 2 years or every 4 years, I think is really critical. And understanding that that engagement and that investment has to be year round in talking to the community as a whole, right, on election and the election and how to really participate in that from that perspective.
Can I
Yeah.
also jump? Oh,
You go first.
okay. I was also going to jump in. Same thing. The census was a really good example, but I think beyond just census and like any policies, I think on a daily basis, government should be working, and there's plenty of opportunities to work with nonprofits to inform processes that they're making on a daily basis, right? If they're going to implement a local policy, it should engage community-based organizations, communities on the local level to really see how it impacts them as they are designing these policies behind doors, right? For example, I live here in Sacramento, and one of the things that the city of Sacramento has been doing is the racial equity initiative, where they bring community-based organizations, community leaders, and they work and they have different committees and they work together with as a institution and as community leaders to talk about what's the road to healing and what is the investment that needs to go back into communities. And so those are like really clear examples, but I think on a daily basis, there's always, and it's really up to also the institutions to be open to engaging community-based organizations in those conversations, not at the end, not when everything's decided, but in the process, in the beginning, so that's not like you're just pulling them to make it look good, right?
Yeah, and a recent example of government partnering with community-based organizations to reach communities that are harder to reach has to do with COVID tracing and vaccination access, information, health and public safety information. So there's other examples too where grants are awarded to community-based organizations to raise awareness for programs like the Golden State Stimulus, California Earned Income Tax Credit, of course, the California Department of Public Health administering public awareness campaigns, on testing and vaccination, which I mentioned. The Department of Social Services does multilingual public outreach activities to increase participation in things like CalFresh. So there's a lot of examples where government can partner with community-based organizations to ensure that we reach the communities who either need services the most or are harder for government outreach to reach, because those community-based organizations are going to have the experience and the cultural, what is the word I'm looking for? In terms of outreach, they're going to be the best messengers for many communities.
Cultural competence.
Yes, that was the word I was looking for.
Next question. Is there any good, unless anyone else wants to chime in on this? Okay. Is there any good research on what issues young people care about and what drives them to actually vote?
Thank you, Santiago, for that question. I went ahead and dropped, some stuff for you in the chat. But yeah, Power California, we conduct a youth poll every 2 years. I went ahead and dropped the 2022 youth poll, but the biggest issues that drove young people to the polls this particular year are definitely reproductive justice, right? So all of the conversations around abortion and bodies who are able to, women bodies. The other thing was housing, right? And this is not just young people. Housing is a big issue for all Californians, right? And that drove a lot of Californians to the poll, right? Not just statewide, but locally. Other things that young people really care about, right, are holding greedy corporations accountable yeah, I'll just check there. There's more to say on that, but I think I might be approaching C4.
There was also a study done by CalPERG quite a few years ago that talked about young people being hesitant to vote if they didn't really understand all of the issues because they don't want to make mistakes. And I think the issue there is, again, education, to be able to provide resources that in clear, plain language, because California ballots are not easy to understand. They are the hardest to, in some ways, of any state I've ever been to. They're the size of phone books, these ballots. And being able to get information out to folks so that they really have a good sense of what they're voting for, so that they have that comfort level to really sort of vote their values is, I think, also an important factor. And with that, it looks like we have cleared the questions. We are also going to follow up, as Melissa mentioned at the outset, with a handout that summarizes a lot of the issues. And if anyone has questions after the fact, we are here to answer them. The handout that we sent to you will have a contact information. And we invite you to join us in finding solutions to these problems. We are trying to open up this dialogue and engage all stakeholders. This is a really an existential problem in California. We have got to get a hold of it. It goes beyond any budget year. You may have seen the LAO just came out with a report that we're likely to have a large deficit, but this is something that goes to the very essence of who we are as a state. It's a long-term problem. We're looking for long-term solutions. It goes beyond any individual budget year. And we all need to work together to figure out solutions. With that, anyone else have anything that they'd like to add before we close? All right. Thank you, everybody. And we will be in touch and want to continue working with you.